Cassette Beasts is a game that I've had my eye on for a while now, and being a big fan of the monster taming genre, I was really looking forward to this fresh take to the formula. But that all went out the window, because despite it having a variety of interesting ideas and being an obvious love letter and more mature take to the Pokemon franchise, it fails to stick the landing. As the game begins, you find yourself washed up on a beach in New Wirral, only to discover that you've entered another world teeming with monsters and mystery, and it isn't long before you're pulled into the main story and a potential way to get home. Now, the core of Cassette Beasts revolves around monsters with powers that can be recorded on cassettes. How? Don't know, please don't ask. We might just tell you at the end of the game, but it for sure won't be a stupid cop-out reason like, the power was within you all along. And we're definitely not using the excuse of magical mystery as a cover for shallow and unoriginal writing. Definitely. But as always, I get ahead of myself. Regardless of the obvious glaring questions the player starts with, you are quickly introduced to the world and its magical beasties after meeting up with, wait, what's her name again? Okay, I'm going to have to break character for a moment. The time of writing this script was the day after I had completed the game and reached the postgame, and I couldn't remember a single NPC's name. I had to look them up to remind me who they are, which is quite the reflection on how forgettable the characters are, and as of the time of this recording, I still can't remember their names off the top of my head. Bringing us back to where we first meet Kaylee, a friendly and cheerful Irish woman in her early 20s. No, I definitely didn't look up her character page in the Cassette Beast wiki for that summary, and definitely remembered the partner character who, other than Barkley, a very good boy of the Pomeranian persuasion, was the one I spent the most time with and maxed out her friendship level. I definitely remember this very specific character who, after maxing out said friendship level, unlocked the romance option, which involved much corny blushing and guitar playing. Was that too much sarcasm? I think that may have been too much sarcasm, but I don't think I can understate this point. Cassette Beasts is surprisingly forgettable. That applies to the vast majority of the game. This forgettableness was particularly disappointing because my first hour or so was really quite fun. The narrative pacing started really well by immediately introducing the first mystery, which was where we are and how we got there. Not long after that, the second greater mystery of how the other varied residents of New Wirral got there in the first place, and where this new world actually is, crops up. The third mystery is the relationship between monsters and cassettes, and implies a musical connection somehow. And this is definitely something that is explored in a great deal of depth through story and gameplay, and definitely isn't glossed over and hand-waved with, music is a kind of magic and so are the monsters, so recording them on cassettes must make sense. And it's definitely fleshed out throughout the game's narrative and gameplay. Definitely. Too much sarcasm again? I've been told I need to emote more. Well, let's get back on topic. The fourth mystery turns up with the first Archangel, raising greater questions about the current conflict and broader world mythology. And this was the precise point in my playthrough where I had the most interest in what the game was giving me. Unfortunately, all that interest dropped off the proverbial cliff once the grind set in and the pacing halted with me in a limbo of repetitive battles, lackluster exploration, and button puzzles that did nothing to exercise my mind. But grind away I did, while performing all sorts of quests and side quests, none of which I can remember off the top of my head because they were all boring, short, and blurred together. Quests themselves are split between main quests, side quests, and rumors. The first two operate as you would expect in an RPG, but rumors are picked up by interacting with NPCs in Harbour Town, who point out area of interests to the player. This could have been a far more interesting way to discover quests, but the mechanic wasn't very fleshed out and amounted to NPCs pointing to a spot on the map and saying go here because maybe. The world of New Wirral is fairly small, but very open, and this is one of those times where the game very nearly does something good. It offers a unique open world to explore and ties in certain cassette beasts with travel abilities the player will be able to use to reach previously inaccessible areas. The problem is that the open world map itself, made up of very small and redundant biomes, which don't do anything beyond providing a different visual theme and clue to the elemental typing of nearby monsters, is very forgettable. I generally find exploration in video games fun, and the world map in Cassette Beasts maintains the game's aesthetic charms, but this time I didn't feel drawn in to explore the world because of that forgettable aspect of everything I was experiencing. This was only exacerbated by the amount of backtracking and repetitive puzzles that do nothing but test the player's patience. When all the puzzles are variations on find a switch, to find another switch, to find another switch, to eventually open a door or a chest, you know you need more study on what makes good puzzle craft for a video game. The player has access to fast travel, only to a handful of very specific, rather inconvenient locations, instead of the campfires, which are better located and would have made for a better fast travel network, which just multiplies the frustrations and boredom brought on by the amount of backtracking and unengaging exploration and puzzle elements. It also doesn't help that chests you find in the overworld contain very little worth the effort put into reaching and unlocking them, as you can purchase most of the useful stickers from shops or by leveling up bootlegs. Valuable materials are also better found elsewhere by fighting rogue fusions, completing quests, and defeating bosses. Those materials are what the player uses to exchange for a variety of different items and upgrades, but all those come down to is having multiple currencies for specific items, which is more annoying than creative, and is one of those mechanics that show a clear disrespect for the player's time. The UI is another disappointing aspect, especially considering how much time is spent in menus, looking through various items and experimenting with monster move builds. Each of these activities have their own screens and menus, with very little thought put to removing extra steps the player has to take through them. For example, cassette storage and your party screens have no direct option to connecting them, so you have to go to one screen to manually leave a cassette in storage, and a completely different screen to go through your storage to bring monsters into your party. Party members take the creature equipped to them with them when you swap them out for another party member. So you often find yourself swapping around monsters for a few minutes in order to restore your team composition. Another annoying inconvenience is the lack of sorting options or item separation for move stickers. There are 14 different elemental types, and moves are split between melee attacks, ranged attacks, passive abilities, and utility moves, but the player has no useful options for sorting these items beyond alphabetical order, which really isn't helpful when each monster you have has multiple move slots and you need to be able to quickly sort and refine your options. Luckily for me, terrible puzzles, crappy chest rewards, unnecessarily bloated trading systems, and a terribly designed UI aren't core features of monster taming games. The monsters and the combat are. Combat draws parallels with Pokemon and other similar monster taming RPGs, featuring turn-based battles with resource management and elemental type matchups at its core. Each monster and move has an elemental type that determines its strengths and weaknesses, and the player can also find bootlegs in the wild, which are extremely rare versions of monsters that have a different type, moveset, and color scheme from others of their species. These type advantages and disadvantages come in the form of buffs, debuffs, and transmutations, which have the potential to be a very interesting way to freshen up this long-lived monster taming mechanic. And they're introduced to the player during combat using narrative description of their interactions, which I thought was a really nice touch. Stickers determine what moves can be used in battle, and the player can get their hands on more of these from leveling up their monster through combat, finding them in the overworld, or purchasing them from vendors in Harbour Town. Any tape in the player's possession can have these stickers added or removed from them outside of battle, and each species is limited to a certain set of stickers that it's allowed to use. This, combined with the unique use of type matchups, allow the player a level of creativity and freedom when it comes to how they want to build their monster teams, which I was initially quite impressed by. That was until I figured out that none of those things really mattered, when all you really need to destroy anything in your path is a monster with the highest attack stat you can find, the strongest attack sticker you have, and a whole bunch of random starter stickers, which cause your monster to attack multiple times before the first round of combat. That sort of built-in cheese would almost be fine if difficulty and challenge didn't matter to the game, but rather than that, the game offers a variety of difficulty settings, allowing players to customize the AI intelligence and level scaling for a tailored challenge, which in and of itself is a really good mechanic. But in this case makes no sense when contrasted with the ability to demolish anything in your path with a single move combo. Visually, Cassette Beasts boasts a unique blend of pixel graphics and 3D elements, giving off vibes reminiscent version of Paper Mario but with a blockier twist. The idle animations for the beasts can be quite slick and pleasing at times, though the variety in move animations and repetition of the same basic animation for multiple actions in combat can be a little boring. The designs for the beasts themselves vary in quality and were fairly unique. They had clear and loving inspirations from mythology, urban legend, and the ability to form puns for names. But again, I find myself struggling to remember them very well because none of them really stood out from the crowd. What did stand out more than most things in my playthrough was the developers' politics. Let me be very clear about this. I am not at all opposed to having a person's politics reflected in a product they create, because one of the core elements of any kind of storytelling is the expansion and exploration of ideas, philosophies, ideologies, and politics within the narrative framework of a fictional world. But here it didn't make much logical sense, really wasn't very intelligently or creatively shown, and didn't have much nuance that I could find in the presented narrative. My first in-game clues to this happened when I first arrived at Harbour Town and explored all of its offerings, and when I was first introduced to the Land Keepers. Harbour Town is a place that has somehow been around for 101 years and survives as some sort of Twitter-flavoured communist commune, where money doesn't exist, people trade a number of different material resources for goods and services, everyone is given property to live in for free, and seemingly people do things for everyone else through sheer kindness and the idea that everyone helps each other because reasons and the power of not being a bad person. The Land Keepers are the other antagonists residents had to deal with throughout the 101 years of the town's history, who are compared to vampires because they want to create a property market and functioning economy on New Wirral. Supposedly, they're trying to create exploitative systems, but there's no real in-game evidence of this beyond partner characters telling us that they're somehow being exploitative, but with no good descriptions of specific actions or events. And I wasn't able to find any real in-game rhyme or reason behind this other than the devs wanting to show that capitalism and ownership of personal property is bad for reasons. This wouldn't be such a negative thing at all if the writing showed any real self-awareness, took the effort to develop those ideologies within the game world, and compared them to opposing ones within the narrative framework presented. But that would be actual world building, that thing which forms a core pillar of any RPG or story. Instead, it just comes across as if it were written by someone who had the same understanding of nuance and the complexities of human socioeconomic behavioral patterns as ChatGPT. It is such a shame and a seriously missed opportunity for a game that seems to want to be a mature entry to the genre. After exploring Harbour Town and speaking to all of the NPCs, I was introduced in more detail to a Persona-esque relationship system, which I really looked forward to experiencing, and which I hoped would add more depth to the character interactions. Really wanted to see how they would implement character interactions and behaviors, and how that would be used to progress relationships through dialogue choices. However, instead of the differing options and responses the players given in other RPGs, the players here are far more limited. Whilst it would be grossly unfair to expect anything close to the unreasonable standard Baldur's Gate 3 would set against this game, I did expect something more than yes and a different way of saying yes. And instead of a variety of interactions and activities being offered to the player as a way to progress character relationships, we get fairly short, forgettable, and unentertaining quest lines for each partner character. Throughout the entire main story and side quests that I played through, I didn't find that dialogue options had any real consequence beyond romance confessions when reaching max friendship level with a partner character. And said partner characters fall in love with you after one or two backstory info dumps that are intended but fail to create an emotional connection between the player and the two-dimensional, forgettable NPCs. This was another point where again my hopes were dashed, as there wasn't much beyond the short quest lines for each partner character and the basic interactions they have when resting at a campfire. And seeing as now my partner character mostly existed as numbers to add to my second monster in combat, I would either choose the one whose stats matched the monster I was using for them, or Barkley, because who doesn't like having a doggo as your best bud on your adventures? Another key feature is fusion, where both your monsters combine into a single creature with the combined stats and move pool of both of them. This is tied both mechanically and narratively to the friendship levels you can build with partner characters, and narratively, the fusion mechanic is incredibly intimate and almost sexual in nature, which could have been incredibly interesting conceptually, but breaks down very quickly when you confuse with a dog, and I really don't want to know why that entered the devs' heads. I really don't. On a practical and mechanical level, fusions were an interesting idea, but failed to actually be a better alternative than two individual beasts, because after fusion you're down to a single action per round, which just makes spamming high AP attacks the only real strategy with any viability, and this is just another thing that breaks down what should have been a unique and rewarding experience for the player. By this point, the pacing which I had enjoyed and had drawn me into the game ground to a halt, as grinding for materials, XP, monster cassettes and traversal abilities became the focus of everything for a while. And it wasn't long before the tedium took its toll and I would turn off the game out of sheer boredom and having to dedicate time to forcing my way to play to the end. I'm not the biggest fan of overly grindy games and never really have been, but this has become even more of a sticking point with me as I come to value and respect my own time more and more. I really dislike mechanics that are intended to pad runtimes and show no respect to the player's time and attention. And for me, those sorts of mechanics are becoming unforgivable deal breakers when it comes to my willingness to hand over my hard-earned money just to be given something designed to literally waste as much of my time as possible between short bursts of something I might actually enjoy. Combine this with the soundtrack, overly chilled out vibe, and glacial narrative pacing, and you get something which, in every practical and atmospheric way, destroys any sense of urgency the player should have when it comes to progressing through the story. The music wasn't terrible by any means, but it really wasn't my cup of tea, and it wasn't long before I went into the game's options to turn off the vocals after having had more than enough repetitions of "it's okay to be uncertain, because I'm certain it's fine." I really don't need my background music pandering to a bizarre sense of positive self-inadequacy when I'm meant to be a competent individual braving the wilds, taking on grand supernatural foes, and finding a way home for all the lost souls on New Wirral. The plot the game presents is shallow, predictable, and thematically all over the place. Overall, the writing combines a lot of ideas from real-life philosophers who make in-game appearances as NPCs to Arthurian legend used as the basis for the game's major antagonist, and by the end of the game, it had either failed to or hand-waved away some of the key mysteries presented at the start while pretending to be deeply philosophical and self-reflective. On a few small occasions, the dev's use of real-life lore was interestingly done and could have been highly compelling, but mostly it just felt like a hodgepodge of different ideas, trying to be more creative than it really is. Pun very much intended, because the big twist is that the main antagonists are really just living embodiments of human ideas and concepts, and all they do is wreak havoc wherever they are because human ideas and concepts are bad, unless they're part of a specific ideology that's always on the side of good because reasons. I cannot emphasize how much I dislike being forced into acting as a character who always and absolutely agreed with everything going on, without any further nuance or opinion. If you're going to give the player dialogue options, then those options should be sufficiently different to each other to provide the player with a way of making a clear choice between them, instead of different shades of the same colour. After completing the main story and majority of side quests, the player is given post-game activities, such as capturing monsters only findable after the main story, re-challenging ranger captains, and continuing to work on job board quests so you can grind for valuable materials needed to unlock more item slots and shop inventories. However, these really aren't enough to keep players engaged for the long haul. There's no point in a repetitive activity at a greater challenge level when the game's own mechanics destroy any potential challenge it can offer. And I'm not shelling out money to pay for DLC content to a game that stopped being enjoyable after the first hour and a half. Alright, it's time to sum up and summarize. Cassette Beasts is a game that tried to do some very interesting things within the monster taming genre, but it misses the mark by quite a lot, and in doing so fails to deliver on what could have been a really unique and enjoyable experience. So if you really do want to play a game that can satisfy that particular itch, but does it in a fresh, entertaining and engaging way while respecting the player's time and attention, just play Monster Sanctuary. It's a much better crafted and well-rounded experience. And as always, my people, take care of yourselves.
Fusion!